There's a pattern that repeats across history, politics, media, and institutions. And once you recognize it, you start seeing it everywhere. Movements don't usually collapse because they lose a battle. They collapse because they lose alignment. In the early stages, a movement is defined by cohesion. There's a sharp sense of purpose, a common direction, and most importantly, a shared incentive structure. People may disagree on details, but they agree on priorities. The internal energy is focused outward. That phase never lasts forever. As a movement grows, attention increases, influence grows, platforms expand, money follows, and once incentives begin to shift, the movement subtly changes shape. What was once about mission becomes about visibility. What was once about discipline becomes about dominance. What was once about shared direction becomes about personal positioning. This is the beginning of fragmentation. In the modern media ecosystem, attention is the most valuable commodity. Algorithms don't reward cohesion, they reward contrast. They don't reward stability, they reward reaction. They don't reward quiet competence, they reward emotional spikes. So the incentive structure changes. Creators, commentators, and voices inside the same ideological ecosystem are no longer aligned toward a common goal. They are competing against each other for the same finite pool of attention. That competition doesn't stay polite long. Internal disagreement becomes public spectacle. Debate turns into moral accusation. Differences of emphasis become tests of loyalty. At that point, the movement starts consuming its own energy. Instead of focusing outward on problems, solutions, or adversaries, the movement turns inward. People begin fighting for narrative control instead of mission success. Winning the argument becomes more important than advancing the cause. This is where credibility starts to erode. Not because people suddenly become wrong, but because coherence disappears. Audiences watching from the outside sense the instability. Even if they can't articulate it, they feel it. The messaging becomes inconsistent. The tone fluctuates widely. The priorities change depending on who's speaking and what generates the most engagement that day. When clarity disappears, trust follows. And here's the critical point most people miss. Movements don't fracture because disagreement exists. They fracture because disagreement becomes profitable. Once conflict generates more engagement than alignment, the system begins reinforcing the most divisive voices. Calm explanation loses ground to emotional escalation. Nuance loses ground to absolutism. The loudest voices rise, not because they're the most accurate, but because they generate the strongest reactions. This creates a feedback loop. Escalation brings attention. Attention brings influence. Influence reinforces escalation. Meanwhile, the disciplined voices, the ones focused on long-term outcomes, are drowned out or sidelined. Not because they're ineffective, but because they don't feed the algorithm. At this stage, a movement doesn't need external opposition to weaken it. It's already doing the work internally. People inside the movement begin questioning motives instead of ideas. Loyalty becomes more important than competence. Emotional alignment becomes more valuable than factual grounding. The environment becomes unstable, and instability is contagious. Followers become reactive instead of reflective. They stop asking, "Is this true?" And they start asking, "Is this ours?" Every issue becomes tribal. Every critique becomes betrayal. Every disagreement becomes proof of corruption. That is how movements lose moral authority without realizing it. Because moral authority doesn't come from volume, it comes from consistency. And consistency requires discipline. Once discipline is replaced by outrage, the movement enters a slow decline, not an immediate collapse, but a loss of gravity. People stop anchoring themselves to it. They stop trusting it to guide them through uncertainty. They may still watch, they may still engage, but they no longer rely on it. That's the fracture. Not loud, not dramatic, just structural. Noise, signal, and why trust is the new currency. Once fragmentation sets in, something else follows almost immediately. Noise. Noise is not just volume, it's confusion masquerading as information. In an environment driven by outrage, everything is framed as urgent. Every issue is elevated to crisis level. Every disagreement is treated as existential. Over time, this creates emotional saturation. Audiences become overwhelmed. When people are constantly exposed to high-intensity messaging, their ability to evaluate information degrades. They stop processing content analytically and start processing it emotionally. The nervous system stays in a reactive state. This is where noise overtakes signal. Signal requires restraint. Noise requires escalation. Signal explains. Noise provokes. Signal slows people down. Noise keeps them agitated. Platforms tend to reward noise because it creates immediate engagement. But there's a trade-off. Noise destroys comprehension. People may feel informed, but they understand less. This is why prolonged exposure to outrage doesn't create better thinkers. It creates exhausted audiences. And exhausted audiences change their behavior. They stop engaging deeply. They stop trusting sources. They disengage from complexity. Instead, they gravitate toward voices that feel steady. Not flashy, not extreme, steady. In unstable times, stability becomes magnetic. This is a shift that's easy to miss if you're focused only on views and engagement metrics. But if you pay attention to retention, loyalty, and long-term audience behavior, the pattern is obvious. People are no longer choosing voices based on how aggressive they are. They're choosing voices based on how grounded they feel. Trust is becoming the primary currency. Trust doesn't come from always being right, though. It comes from being consistent. It comes from not exaggerating, from not jumping every headline, from acknowledging uncertainty without exploiting it. When people feel manipulated, even subtly, they withdraw trust. When they feel someone is using fear as leverage, they disengage. When every message feels like a sales pitch for outrage, credibility collapses. This is why outrage-driven influence tends to burn hot and burn out. It spikes fast. It collapses faster. Because outrage doesn't compound. Trust does. Trust compounds slowly, quietly, and over time. It doesn't require daily escalation. It requires discipline. It requires knowing when not to speak. It requires separating what matters from what merely trends. This is where the long game begins to matter. Voices that remain calm while others escalate start to stand out. Not immediately, but eventually. People remember who didn't panic, who didn't exaggerate, who didn't manipulate emotions for clicks. Those voices become reference points, not because they demand attention, but because they earned it. This is the inflection point many creators and commentators are facing right now, whether they realize it or not. Do you optimize for reaction or for reliability? Do you optimize for reaction or reliability? Do you chase immediacy or build permanence? Do you want spikes or foundations? The future doesn't belong to the loudest voices in the room. It belongs to the ones people trust when the room gets loud. Movements that survive aren't the ones with the most energy. They're the ones with the most discipline. An influence that lasts isn't built on noise. It's built on signal. That's the shift happening beneath the surface. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.